My name is James Causey, and I'm a columnist with the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, and I'm here with author Lee Hawkins. The book that he did is I Am Nobody's Slave, How Uncovering My Family's History Set Me Free. He's in town tonight for a book signing, and he's going to be talking about his book. So I'm glad that you were able to take some time with us to talk about your book.
Thanks for having me. So happy to be here, James.
I appreciate it. Now, we worked together for a long time when you used to work at the paper, and it's just good to have you back in the newsroom to talk about this important subject. So let's get started. Tell us what is the book about?
The book is about a 400-year investigation, or an investigation into 400 years of history, to find out how enslavement, Jim Crow, the Great Migration, and integration impacted the way that I was raised. You know, my father was from Alabama. And when I was a kid, sometimes he would have nightmares, but he would never tell me what he was dreaming about. And so I would have to ask, and he would just say Alabama, but he wouldn't go into details. And the reason it was important to figure out how history affected my present was because, not just because of me, but because there were so many black kids around me and my contemporaries. I consider myself part of the integration generation, which means that, like you, I was the first generation in my family to be born under the Constitution equal to a white person. Mm-hmm. Even though my family had been in America for the since the 1600s. So really, in a way, I'm a first generation American, mm-hmm. even though I'm a descendant of Revolutionary War soldiers and people on both sides of the Civil War, because of the fact that some of my DNA hails from enslavers, which is not uncommon as well in the black community. Over 90% of black Americans who are foundational to this country have DNA from the enslaver. And so what did that do for me? Well, it opened up an opportunity for me to contact that side of the family and to go into their records and their archives. And the whole question was, a lot of the things that I experienced as a kid, with a very loving, omnipresent father, led me to believe that there were things that happened under Jim Crow that were much less about segregation and much more about trauma. Mm-hmm. And I really wanted to know my family's lineage and what we had experienced in the United States of America, and what my father had lived through.
So one of the most important, or I believe an important part of the book, is when you went back to Alabama.
Yes.
What happened in Alabama?
Well, James, we had not, I grew up in Minnesota, mm-hmm. Very similar to a lot of people who live here in Wisconsin, who were black people who, had family members in the South, but at some point their grandparents or parents did the Great Migration. Mm-hmm. And what that basically did was it separated a lot of our families. I mean, I do have friends who I know who were able to go back to the South and spend summers with aunts and uncles and things like that and get to know their cousins. But then there was another, group of people who I knew who their parents, like mine, would not go back and would not speak in detail about it, and said, that there were just things that they would rather not discuss. And so there was a time around 1991, my sister was graduating from college in North Carolina, and my father made the decision that we would drive, and we would go to Alabama after that. And so he wanted to interview an uncle who was at the time probably about 92 years old, because that was his mother's brother, and his mother had died when he was 12, which was the reason he moved to Minnesota. And so this Uncle Isaac Pugh, he gave us this incredible account of his life. One of the deepest pains of his life was that his father was murdered when he was a young person and he was murdered by a white man named Jack Taylor, who basically killed him over livestock, but there was also another dispute happening over land. And my great-grandfather, Isaac Pugh Sr., was actually shot in the back as a result of that. And so that was the first time we learned about that murder, because my father's mother had told him for the time that he had her, was that her father was killed in a hunting accident. Mm-hmm. He also told us about his grandmother. And he told us about this grandmother who was really a mean old lady. And when they would be working on the farm, she would whip them if they weren't being productive enough. She would weigh, their strawberries or their cotton or whatever. Right. And if they weren't being productive enough, she would whip them. And her name was Grandma Charity. And so he told me these things. And it was an interview that, we did record. But at the time I was very young. And I wasn't much of a reporter, at the time. So I think that it was just interesting family history to me. Mm-hmm. And when Ancestry.com came out, and I had all of these different people who were doing Ancestry.com, I decided, well, maybe I should dig in. And I started to dig in and was able to share some of the discoveries that I was making with my dad. And then my dad started to open up. Mm-hmm. And that opened up this whole avenue in which I wasn't necessarily thinking about writing a book as much as I was thinking about finally getting answers to questions that had escaped me for generations, and for questions that had escaped my dad for generations, because he told me, you know what, my mother and father didn't tell me a lot. Mm-hmm. And because I was the youngest, my sisters and brothers coddled me, Lee. So one of the reasons I didn't share a lot of information with you was because I didn't have the information. And so that sort of genealogical disillusionment was a journey that I embarked, was something that haunted me so deeply and haunted my father so deeply that I embarked upon this journey in order to start to bring about some healing for me and for my dad. And that trip to Alabama that you asked about was so critical, and we had no idea what he was giving us at that time. But when I took the DNA test, I was able to see the name of my great-grandfather and Grandma Charity's name pop up on my DNA chart. And then that was the thing that really opened everything up wide.
One thing that you mentioned in a past interview is that, genealogy tests are important, but what's important is what happens between that dash, between when someone is born and when they die. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yes, I think that we are so often thinking of our genealogy in terms of just building a family tree. Well, I got the tree, and this person's here and this person's there, and now we're done, and of course that's powerful as well. But there are storylines in a lot of those different people on that tree. And just to give you a sense of what I mean by that, Grandma Charity was thought to be this mean old crazy, disciplinary woman that would abuse the children, and they hated her, they despised her. Mm-hmm. And that was the image that I had, a very pathologized image of this woman, pathological image of her. Mm-hmm. But when I did the research, James, I dug deeper and I found out that I found a will. Mm-hmm. I found a will that was tied to a white man named Jesse Pugh, who kept popping up as one of my blood relatives. And when I researched him, I found out that he actually he owned enslaved people. And I found his will, and in his will it said, "To my son Maston, I give Charity, a Negro girl." And so at that time, that was the first understanding that I had, that Grandma Charity was actually in bondage for the first 30 years of her life. Wow. That was a huge omission. Mm-hmm. on the part of my uncle, probably because there were a lot of people who internalized slavery as shame, but also wanted to protect us by not giving us that kind of information. And in that case, he didn't talk about it at all. I know 100% that he knew that, mm-hmm. because he actually knew who the father of his father was, who was actually a white man. But we knew that Grandma Charity at that point was this through the DNA analysis, we were able to find out, that it was actually Grandma Charity who was sexually assaulted by the enslaver, and that this had happened to women through generations, which is why 90% of African Americans have European DNA. And so it's important to get these narratives down so that we don't pathologize our ancestors, and also we understand what they went through and also what they overcame, and what they were able to live through, oftentimes, unfortunately, not because of America, but despite America. And so this history was like critical for me, and I think that the reason we have to do more of that sort of hard work, digging into the difficult stories, is because our ancestors and our elders carry so much within for generations, and they don't want to talk about the things that pain them deeply. And so, Alex Haley used to say that when an ancestor dies, it's like a library burned down. And I think it's important to interview the oldest person in the room at the Thanksgiving dinner or the Christmas dinner, because when you sit that recorder down and you give them the opportunity to speak, there is almost like an epigenetic awareness within them that this may be one of their last chances. And that when you do that, if you just sit down and ask the questions and let them talk, even if there's the awkward silence, awkward silence makes people keep talking. Let them talk. And when they stumble upon things, like they might say, well, yeah, we had another brother. You didn't know him. Well, why didn't I know him? Well, he actually died when we were 8 years old. Well, how did he die? Well, there was a fire and the barn burned down and he was in it and we couldn't save him. And as a result of that, we moved because we just couldn't stay in that county any longer, because everything we saw reminded us of that little boy. And, people can be holding these stories in for generations, but therein lies the reason your grandmother was so protective over you, because she lost a brother when her brother was 8 years old. So when you were 8 years old, if you did something wrong, maybe it seemed like it was, severe, the discipline that you received. But when you unpack all of these things, you start to see the humanity of people and start to forgive people for things that may have happened that have a lot more to do with their situation at the time. And it starts to bring about healing.
So that's a very interesting point. So when you think about your family history and you think about the trauma that was endured by your family members and all the deaths, the atrocities done to them by white people, that and nobody was ever prosecuted in those instances, what does that do for you to unlock some of these mysteries?
Well, I grew up in Minnesota, as I told you, and I had one foot very firmly planted in the Black community, the historic Rondo community where my church was and my community was. But I also lived in a suburb called Maplewood in Minnesota, which was 99% white. And when we were kids, our father was very, very hyper cautious about, our safety. The rules were very rigid. And if you stepped too far to the left or too far to the right of the rules, the belt was what you received. I received over 150 belt whippings as a kid. And one of the reasons that was because I had family members who were murdered. And I didn't know that at the time because my father wouldn't talk about it. It wasn't until I did this investigation that I found out that every generation since 1837, I've had a murder in my family, including my grandfather and both of my great-grandfathers. My grandparents were 5 and 9 years old when their fathers were murdered. And, James, I know you cover a lot that has to do with the homicide crisis and the families who have family members murdered and the grief that imposes on people, especially children. You know, adverse childhood experiences have shown to shorten life expectancy and to, basically create, mental health challenges sometimes for people that could be dealt with if they had the right support, right? But back then, if you're living under Jim Crow apartheid and you're living in a place like Alabama or Mississippi, this is a place where Emmett Till was killed in Mississippi, right? And there's a whole lynching museum where you see generations upon generations of people who were, murdered. And when that happens and you're living on the site of terror in the 1950s, there's just not the level of support that we even have now, which is still not enough. And so when we think about the burden of silence that a lot of people carried, that all of those murders were the things that made my father be so, intent on almost trying to scare us into perfect behavior, because he thought, hey, you go into a Walgreens and you buy a candy bar and you don't get a receipt. What are you doing?
Exactly.
You could end up getting accused of shoplifting, and that's something that will stay with you for the rest of your life. And that seemed to be like really hypersensitive. And sometimes, my sister and I would laugh at my dad. We'd say, oh, here's dad again with this paranoid stuff. But the truth of it is that we didn't realize the privilege that we had the privilege of living in an integrated environment and living in an integrated environment where we had many more rights than my father had. And, we didn't appreciate why my father's brain was still very much locked in Alabama when we were in Minnesota. So for me to be the class president all 4 years and my sister to become the class president all 3 years and be the homecoming queen as well in a predominantly white neighborhood, that was very, almost like Twilight Zone for my dad,
So, when you say you've been with about hundreds of times, and, I talk to a lot of people and they all have a whipping story. I would whip with a belt. My parents made me go pick out a switch. Some people would whip with extension cords. I know you're anti-abuse like that, but is there ever a time where a child, in your opinion, could be disciplined physically? Or do you think that should always be off the table?
I think it should always be off the table. And here's why. There was a time, James, where I believed in it, even, when it was happening to me and for years after. But it wasn't until my early 30s when I started to deal with debilitating brain fog and I started to deal with anxiety and a lot of different things that sometimes in certain situations would make it hard for me to calm down. Where I would get, I would just be, walking in certain places and things, what's happening here, what's happening over there. And that sort of feeling of never being calm was something that I started to research. And as I started to learn more about adverse childhood experiences, I know we both did a study, we did a fellowship at USC that was focused on child well-being. I started to understand that a lot of what I was experiencing had a lot to do with my childhood, and the idea that when I was disciplined with the belt, it wasn't necessarily what I thought, that, you get the belt and you get a bruise and it goes away after a couple of days. The real impact was, I'm going to get the belt again.
Gotcha.
And this idea of consistently having that fight or flight response triggered over and over and over. And so what I learned after talking to neuroscientists and pediatricians is that the impact on the parasympathetic nervous system pretty much hardwires you to the point where there's a lot of cortisol and adrenaline and stress toxins that over time make people sick. And so I think, it's for sure that we know that there's some level of brain damage that can be caused, and there are all kinds of neurological reasons and effects on the nervous system that it should not happen. I think the thing that scares me the most is the idea of normalized violence. I don't see corporal punishment and the fact that we got the switch as kids and many other Black Americans did as limited to the Black community. Because when I went into the research, I was able to see that my ancestors who came over from Europe left a very violent society where there was flogging and there was whipping and all of that. And all they did was create a sort of dual system, criminal justice system here and a slavery system here, in which whipping was very, very prevalent. Now, we talked about Grandma Charity, who was in bondage for the first 30 years, who used to weigh the actual strawberries and cotton that my uncle and his siblings would pick and then whip them if they were not working fast enough. Well, that goes back to Edward Baptist, the book that he wrote called The Half Has Never Been Told, which focuses on the pushing system in part of the book. The pushing system was a system in which after the cotton gin was invented, the enslavers needed to get more out of the people they had because they couldn't go to the bank to get more enslaved people because they'd leveraged themselves for getting the cotton gin. And so what would they do? They would whip. And at the end of every day, if a person had not met their quota, they would get whipped in front of everybody. And so this was a practice that originated from colonization and was internalized and handed down after the generations, but it didn't start with us. And so why do I think it should not happen? Because I believe that if slavers believed that it was empowering and beneficial for Black people, they wouldn't have done it. And if parents who love their children knew about the level of pain and trauma and effect on the nervous system, I don't think they would do it either. And so I think the challenge now is to start to address and confront the extent of violence that stems from America's origin story and figure out how do we rid our homes of that. Because so much of the violence that we see, all of the violence that we see is a result of the larger violence and the idea that in this country, violence has been inextricably tied to our reality. And so nonviolent social change needs to not just be outward in areas of protest, but it actually needs to be in the home, and understanding that when we do that, when we make that vow of nonviolence as men to our wives, as children or parents to our children, we start to understand the power of conflict resolution. And conflict resolution is at the heart of any progress that we make in this country. And I believe that it needs to be something that is more instituted more consciously in order to put the family in a position where the family can start to reduce violence in families and communities in ways that our government has failed to do. Right, right now corporal punishment is legal in 17 states,
yeah.
And it's primarily in the states where slavery was prevalent. And we also find that the disproportionate use of it against Black children tends to correspond, according to Dr. Jeff Ward, tends to correspond in counties where lynching was the highest. And so this idea of this tradition of of excessive force being used against people of color. You know, black girls in Mississippi, for instance, are hit multiple times more than white girls for the same offenses. And so what we have to understand is the legacy of colonialism and how that still plays out in modern times. And I think the hard part is, you know, my book deals with the external threat of racism, but also the internalized racism that we as a black community have yet to confront, right? Mm-hmm. And I think it plays out. There was a guy named Dr. Elvin Poussin, who was a very respected psychologist who I interviewed many times and had a profound impact on me. He talked about how in the 1980s he went several times thereafter, he went down south to try and talk to educational leaders in the black community about making an effort to try to get corporal punishment repealed because of the effect that he knew that had on children as a psychologist or as a psychoanalyst. And he said some of the greatest pushback that he received were from the black educators themselves. And so we have to the controversial part of this book is how deeply ingrained some of these colonizer traditions are in our own community, and understanding that. Why is that? Why do we internalize that? Because we are American. The first person to shed blood for this country was Crispus Attucks, a black man. And so the socialization of the black American community is parallel to the socialization of the broader community.
Well, that's very interesting, because when I raised in church, I mean, there was always a talk, spare a rod, spoil a child. But let me ask you one last question. With all the trauma that's been endured by the descendants of slaves, make a case for reparations in this country for those people.
Well, you know, I would always broaden it. I think that the conversation about reparations in this country needs to be broadened to look at the fact that there are 8 million survivors of Jim Crow apartheid. And so when I can see why there's a large contingent of this country that believes that reparations wouldn't be justified. But a lot of it is based on misinformation, willful ignorance, but also a lot of legitimate ignorance. Most of us were taught that Jim Crow was segregation. But when you look deeper into families like mine, you know, unfortunately, we're not rare. There are many African American families who lived through, you know, first of all, we had 12 generations of our ancestors enslaved, if for those of us who came in the beginning. And then we have another 5 generations of people who lived through apartheid, who did not have equal constitutional rights. And 8 million of those people are alive today. So what I don't understand is, how could you not have the conversation about reparations for those 8 million people who didn't have equal voting rights, who didn't have equal access to housing, who didn't have equal access to public accommodation, who had family members murdered, who had, family members murdered and the killers were not convicted due to all white juries and basically kangaroo courts where justice was not administered. And these people had to live through that, right? And the fact that there are 8 million people, that any black person over 60 who was raised in a community where Jim Crow was the law had to deal with that and were never even acknowledged as apartheid victims. And it's hard to even use the word victim in the context of Black American, because so many of us are victors. So many of us have been successful through collaboration, through working twice as hard, through a lot of different movements that we've had in this country that boil down to the fact that we are some of the most effective activists in the history of this country. we are the people who pushed America closer to becoming that more perfect union through the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and leading that movement. And so when people see, the hyper visible symbols of Black success, they see the Obamas, they see Oprah Winfrey, they see Beyonce, they see, Michael Jordan, they then believe, well, look at this, my kids are listening to hip hop music every day, and they believe that somehow that means that our people haven't been through anything, when really, when I saw, for instance, my uncle L.C. Crenshaw, who was a World War II veteran and came back from the war and was denied the GI Bill, but still found a way to get an extra job at a packing house and also at the Ford plant and buy a home anyway. And I saw that generations of my family had to do that throughout, as a result of also racial covenants that were put into property deeds that said that a Black American should not buy this home or a Jewish American should not be able to buy these homes. When you look at all of that, I don't see how, especially when we acknowledge the fact that 8 million people who lived through that are alive today, I don't see how there isn't a valid discussion for reparations. And I really don't know how it's possible for us to move forward as a country and really heal as a country until we have a conversation about that and we see a process of acknowledgement and reconciliation. And the healing can't come until we do that. I don't think America will ever be free until it reckons with the truth of its origins.
Right. I lied. I got one more question for you. When you see the repeal and the attempt to erase African American history in this country, when you see images of the enslaved people in museums taken out, when you see books being taken out of schools that talk about the enslaved, what does that do for you as a historian of your own family history? What does that tell you about how we progress in this country?
Well, I think I have a unique perspective because, when we see these narratives like the ones that I wrote, it's usually focusing on a Black family from Philadelphia or a Black family from LA or New York. We rarely see the biographies of Black families from Wisconsin or Minnesota. Sometimes people don't even know there are Black people in these states, right?
Right.
But the truth is that we fought, and our history is pretty much American history. The white supremacy aspect of America is American history. It's not Black American history, right? The fact that what we were able to accomplish under the constructs of the system we were in is Black American history. And so when we think about that brutal American history, we have to understand that there was a lot of darkness, but there was also light. We had emancipation, not just slavery. We had the passage of the Civil Rights Act, not just Jim Crow. We had women's suffrage movement that led to greater rights for women. And so all through the generations, there's been a great deal of progress. And I think when we start to take history out of museums and out of curriculums and everything, we're just taking away from the complexity of this nation. If you love the nation, then we should lean into the hardest parts about the American story. I think that's the most patriotic thing that we can do. That's what Thomas Jefferson did. That's what the Constitutional Convention did. That's what Dr. Martin Luther King did. They didn't spend their time sitting around talking about how great America was. Abraham Lincoln too. When you look at all of his most iconic speeches, they all have to do with America beginning to deal with a lot of the mistakes that we'd made and how there was this vision for this more perfect union. And so I think taking books out of curriculums and museums is about the most anti-American thing that we can do if we really love our country and we really want our country to be the best country and the best version of ourselves. And I'll also say that because I grew up in Minnesota in a community that was largely Scandinavian, I think it hurts me to know that a lot of my friends who I grew up with, that their kids will go through the same things that their parents went through. And what I mean by that is so many kids I grew up with were from a homogenous background and they lived in a bubble. And because they didn't have exposure to diversity when they were young, it's harder for them. It was harder for them to go out in the world and achieve. Because of the fact that every time they would go into certain environments, they would freeze up because they didn't know how to interact with people who didn't look like them. And so this idea of not knowing what to say because you're afraid that what you're going to say could be perceived as racist, not being able to have friendships or to understand other people's cultures because you have not had to and you weren't taught those things in school, there's a point where it starts to be harmful to people's advancement. And I always say, if we're going to teach history, and it can't be for altruistic reasons, let it be for capitalistic reasons. Let it be because we want our children of all races to be ready for the world they're about to enter. When you look at 2045, we're going to have a situation where whites are no longer the majority. There'll be about 50% of the nation, and minoritized people will be split amongst that. And so, but there will be no majority. And at that time, going into cities like Miami and Atlanta and LA and all of these major cities across the country, it's going to be hard for a kid from Florida or a kid from Minnesota who lived in a gated community where they didn't get a lot of exposure to the culture to thrive. The black children and the brown children in this country are always going to be exposed to their culture. And of course, in a colonized society or an inherited colonized society, we all know the King's English, right? And so what happens with those kids? Well, if you're able to be successful across racial lines and across the margins, usually that means you're going to be successful in life and that you have a much better advantage than those people who weren't exposed to that level of diversity. And so right now I feel sorry for the kids who will not have access to the lessons about basic truth in American history and who have this sort of, this false belief that somehow, believing the lie that you were told the first step that you took into kindergarten, that George Washington never told a lie and that we should never question the American narrative. That is such a damaging thing to go through. And I don't think that our forefathers of this country, when they did that constitutional convention, I don't think that that's what they envisioned. I think that they envisioned a more complex view of patriotism, a more responsible view of patriotism that recognized the hardest history of this country so that we would not make those mistakes again. And I think this is really, when I see that, James, and I'm sorry, I'm really passionate about this question, when I see it, it tells me that this is a period of darkness for America. The anti-intellectualism, the idea that people can't have an honest conversation across the aisle without feeling that someone should be murdered because they disagree. I mean, that we're in this era now. Exactly. Was what I talk about, violent social change as opposed to nonviolent social change. And a lot of that is because there's so many people who have been discouraged from critical thinking, and they've been discouraged from being able to process ideas and to sit down and have intelligent conversations. And so they feel helpless and they decide, well, I might as well take it out in the form of violence. And that is a failure of our educational system. It's a failure of our institutions across the board, that we have now failed to address the violence in our country, and we all have blood on our hands as a result of that. The last thing I'll say, just to end on a positive note, is that I think that the pushback, the fact that you're asking this question and the pushback that's being raised by people whose primary allegiance is to the well-being of our nation as opposed to any political party is something that I'm encouraged by. And I don't believe that it's sustainable. I believe that this level of censorship that we're seeing with book banning and everything, I don't believe it's sustainable, because I think that we have a whole, body of work that preceded all of this, in which children were able to at least read, a wide range of things within the canon, which is ever evolving. And, that's the part that I can be optimistic about. I think that the right thing will ultimately happen once we start to see how damaging this could be. And if they get to the point where they're taking things out of museums, it's not going to hurt Black people. It's going to hurt the people who need the information the most, because we will always have our history. Our history cannot be taken away from us. We are unstoppable and irrepressible. I want the nation to be irrepressible, and we can't get to that point until we start to resolve and confront a lot of the issues that keep on generation after generation being tucked away.
Quickly, Lee, tell us how we could get this book.
Yeah, so this book can be purchased online, and it can also be purchased in a lot of major bookstores, including Barnes & Noble. And so, yeah, take a look at it. The one thing about this, James, is that I narrated the audiobook.
Yes.
And I think that, that was a medium where I really tried to put in a lot of emotion and give people an idea of what I was going through at the most critical times that we talked about before. And so that's another way to interact with this. I'm starting to see that people are taking in information in different ways, and I think the audiobook is really a strong way to listen to this.
Fantastic, Lee Hawkins.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, and I'm so happy to be in Milwaukee. So happy. And one more thing I wanted to mention, the mental health of children is an issue. I understand that was an issue, the issue of the year, right? I can't tell you how critical that is, in the fact that Wisconsin is out front on that. It's a very forward-looking agenda, and I think that mental health and well-being in children and addressing childhood trauma is of tantamount importance, and I don't think that we can ignore the fact that Wisconsin has done that, because underlying all of that is the answer for life expectancy and healthy and brighter futures for the state and hopefully for the nation. Hopefully more states will follow that. But I was very proud when I heard that Wisconsin was out front on that.
Well, thanks again, Lee.
Thanks a lot.
Appreciate it.